They said the atom bomb changed the world. But what terrified us wasn't the blast. It was the belief behind it. What if loyalty feels like love, and love looks like treason? How far would you go for an idea you can't hold? Only carry? The atomic age promised safety, but every promise needs someone to pay for it. In 1953, two ordinary names carried the weight of global fear: Julius, Ethel. Not masterminds in a lair, parents in a kitchen, a typewriter, a belief, a silence that would not break. We wanted certainty. We built systems for it. Clearances, files, fences. But certainty has a cost: guilt without confession, faith without forgiveness, and a country learning to fear its own truth. This isn't only a spy story. It's a stress test of the human mind. Loyalty split like the atom into love and consequence. If you were them, would you speak? If you were us, would you listen? They built a weapon meant to protect the world, and were killed by the secrets it created. In August 1949, a short dispatch from Moscow reached Washington. It carried only a few sentences, but those sentences overturned the balance of the world. The Soviet Union announced it had successfully tested an atomic device. Within hours, analysts in the Pentagon and the Atomic Energy Commission compared seismic data from Central Asia and confirmed what had been feared impossible. The explosion had occurred at Semipalatinsk on August 29. The age of American monopoly over the atom had ended. In the White House, the realization moved through officials like a physical shock. 4 years earlier, the United States had been the only nation capable of harnessing the chain reaction that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Scientists had estimated that the Soviets would need a decade to reach the same threshold. Yet the evidence showed a weapon detonated with a yield of 20 kilotons, close to the first American test at Trinity. That accuracy meant blueprints, data, and design principles had somehow crossed oceans and borders. Military planners began rewriting contingency documents. The Strategic Air Command calculated new flight ranges and survival odds. The Joint Chiefs met in emergency session, reading classified summaries that explained the implausible similarity between the Soviet bomb and the American Fat Man design. Intelligence officers concluded the information leak must have come from within the Manhattan Project itself. The question was not if secrets had been stolen, but who had carried them out of Los Alamos. Within the FBI, the order came to trace every scientist and technician who had ever handled fissile research. Field offices in New York, Chicago, and Albuquerque re-examined dormant security files. Agents reopened background checks on physicists, chemists, and engineers who had left government service since 1945. Each report moved upward through layers of redaction, until it reached Director J. Edgar Hoover. The Bureau had already been monitoring Communist Party networks since the late 1930s. But now atomic espionage replaced ideology as the highest priority. In early 1950, British security officers confronted Dr. Fuchs after deciphering intercepted Soviet communications. The confession he gave in London provided the first tangible evidence of atomic theft. He admitted supplying technical data about bomb construction to Soviet contacts since 1943. The news reached Washington within days, confirming the American suspicion that the breach was real. The FBI traced Fuchs's courier to a Philadelphia chemist named Harry Gold. Once Gold confessed, the Bureau began following his chain of contacts through the United States, each link revealing another layer of the network. Meanwhile, by late 1949, the FBI's internal memoranda described the effort as a race against the enemy, already inside. Every intercepted letter, every overheard conversation, every unexplained trip abroad was logged. Agents worked through nights photographing suspect documents and cross-checking code names from decrypted cables. The Bureau's scientific consultants compared the Soviet bomb's construction reports with classified American blueprints, confirming uncanny overlaps in lens design and initiator composition. These correspondences prove that espionage had been methodical, not accidental. Hoover ordered full surveillance of known Communist Party members with technical backgrounds. Wiretaps multiplied, mail was intercepted, and informants were planted in university departments and engineering firms. The Bureau treated the Manhattan Project's alumni as both national heroes and potential betrayers. Lists were drawn and redrawn as new information surfaced. Each revelation narrowed the field of suspicion, tightening around a small circle of individuals who had moved between New York and Los Alamos during the war. Inside the Atomic Energy Commission, analysts examined laboratory shipment records, visitor logs, and clearance lists dating back to 1943. Small irregularities, missing notebooks, unauthorized photo reproductions, unreported meetings, took on new significance. Reports from British and Canadian intelligence hinted at parallel penetrations abroad, suggesting a coordinated Soviet effort. Washington realized that the espionage network was neither small nor isolated. It had been systematic, disciplined, and effective. The first wave of interrogations targeted scientists, already under quiet suspicion. Agents questioned them about political meetings in the 1930s, signatures on petitions, and old associations with left-wing groups. Some were cleared quickly. Others were referred for deeper investigation. Those who had once seen communism as an ally against fascism found their wartime sympathies reinterpreted as treachery. Careers built on scientific achievement now stood under the shadow of loyalty oaths and security hearings. At the same time, Congress expanded legislative powers for internal security. The Smith Act and subsequent loyalty programs provided the legal framework for arrests and indictments. The Department of Justice coordinated with the FBI to manage prosecutions once the spies were identified. Within this environment, any connection to radical politics became a liability, and fear spread through academic and industrial communities alike. By early 1950, fragments of testimony began converging. Klaus Fuchs's confession led directly to Harry Gold. Gold's statements led to David Greenglass, a machinist once stationed at Los Alamos. Through Greenglass, investigators uncovered a link to Julius Rosenberg, an electrical engineer in New York, who had worked for the Army Signal Corps during the war. The network was forming a visible outline, each name binding the next in a web that stretched from government laboratories to urban apartments. The discovery confirmed the scope of the breach, but did little to calm the atmosphere of distrust. Inside government offices, security officers reviewed clearances. Outside, citizens whispered about infiltration and betrayal. Newspapers reported arrests, but the details were too complex for public comprehension. To many, the entire scientific community now appeared suspect. The very intellect that had created the bomb seemed to carry within it the potential for subversion. In private briefings, Hoover emphasized that espionage was not the work of a single traitor, but of an organized conspiracy. He framed the Bureau's mission as both investigation and moral defense. The arrests that would follow, Fuchs abroad, Gold in Philadelphia, Greenglass and the Rosenbergs in New York, would represent the culmination of that strategy. Yet in 1949, all of it was still anticipation, a tightening coil of evidence waiting to spring. The intelligence community coordinated its efforts through interagency committees. The Army's Counterintelligence Corps, the Navy's Office of Naval Intelligence, and the newly formed CIA each contributed fragments of information. The FBI, however, remained at the center of the domestic search. Its agents followed leads across states, piecing together evidence of meetings, coded messages, and payments from Soviet diplomatic staff in New York. Every confirmed connection added urgency to the operation. In November 1949, a top-secret report concluded that the Soviet Union's rapid progress could not have occurred without direct acquisition of classified data concerning the design, construction, and initiation of fission weapons. The phrasing was deliberate and grave. It implied that an American betrayal had accelerated the enemy's path to nuclear capability. The realization marked the end of post-war innocence within the scientific establishment and the beginning of the most extensive counter-espionage campaign in U.S. history. Winter settled over Washington as committees convened behind closed doors. Files once labeled confidential were reclassified as top secret. The Department of Justice authorized the FBI to pursue the atomic espionage case with unrestricted jurisdiction. Field offices doubled their staff. Agents who had once investigated organized crime or interstate fraud now turned to counterintelligence. The Bureau's analytical units compiled charts of connections, familial, professional, political, linking every suspect to the next. The public knew little of these developments. To the average citizen, the announcement of the Soviet test was already fading behind daily headlines. Yet within the government, every decision now carried nuclear implications. Military budgets expanded. Laboratories accelerated research into the hydrogen bomb. The sense of urgency permeated every department. No one wanted to be responsible for underestimating the enemy again. By the first weeks of 1950, the outlines of betrayal had hardened into names and faces. Warrants were prepared, surveillance intensified, and interrogation plans drawn. The investigation had evolved from suspicion into pursuit. The Bureau understood that its success would define American security for decades to come. The hunt for the atomic spies had begun in earnest, born from a single detonation, half a world away. What had started as a distant explosion in the Kazakh steppe had reshaped the conscience of a nation. The power once regarded as a triumph of science now demanded vigilance that bordered on paranoia. The atom had escaped its creators, and with it came a new era, in which secrets once lost could ignite the world. The men and women who would soon fill the interrogation rooms, the courtrooms, and the headlines were already in motion, unaware that history had chosen them to embody its lesson. The machinery of investigation was awake, relentless, and certain of its purpose. The Soviet test had done more than end American monopoly. It had created a mirror through which the United States would see itself, divided between fear and conviction, science and loyalty, progress and control. Out of that reflection came the decision that would dominate the next years: to find the traitors, expose their network, and restore the illusion of security that had vanished in a single flash of atomic light. In the spring of 1943, a stretch of New Mexico plateau was emptied of its ranchers and posted with warning signs. The Army Corps of Engineers fenced the mesas and built a town that did not appear on any map. Its mail was routed through Santa Fe under a numbered box. Its residents were told not to discuss their work beyond the gates. The official name was Project Y, a branch of the Manhattan Engineer District, but among those who lived there, it was simply Los Alamos. Trucks arrived day and night carrying lumber, concrete, and the first wave of scientists, young men and women drawn from universities and laboratories across the country. They came under military orders, but without uniforms, issued identification badges instead of rank. Each carried the burden of secrecy. The country was at war across the Atlantic. Whole cities were burning. And in the Pacific, invasion plans demanded a weapon that could end the conflict without the cost of another Normandy. The purpose of Los Alamos was to build that weapon. Robert Oppenheimer directed the laboratory. Under him, theoretical physicists, chemists, metallurgists, and engineers worked in compartments of knowledge. No single team saw the entire design. Only Oppenheimer and a handful of senior staff understood how the pieces fit together. The security office enforced compartmentalization through locked safes, coded memos, and a constant reminder that loose words could lose lives. Still, the project grew faster than its security system. Within a year, thousands of people lived on the mesa, scientists with their families, enlisted guards, technicians, janitors, and clerks. Among them were émigré scientists who had fled Europe's fascism. They brought unmatched expertise in theoretical physics and a profound belief that defeating Hitler justified any secrecy. Yet their loyalty often carried layers of complexity: gratitude to America, nostalgia for Europe, and admiration for the Soviet Union, whose armies were then bearing the brunt of the war. Those sympathies would later form the cracks through which Moscow's intelligence would reach the heart of the project. Klaus Fuchs arrived, under British clearance, as part of the cooperative wartime mission, known as the Tube Alloys Delegation. He was quiet, precise, and tireless. Respected for his mathematical clarity, no one questioned his background beyond the official file that labeled him a refugee from Nazi Germany. And a subject of His Majesty's government, his accent blended easily among other Europeans. In the laboratory, his reports on theoretical implosion calculations were admired. His efficiency meant that he handled sensitive material daily, unseen by those around him. Copies of those calculations were summarized after hours in notes destined for Soviet intelligence. In 1944, machinist David Greenglass arrived at Los Alamos as part of the Army's Special Engineer Detachment. He worked in the machine shop, fabricating components for experimental assemblies. His assignment seemed minor, but it provided physical access to the weapon's mechanical core. Unbeknown to his supervisors, he was already entangled in the orbit of his brother-in-law Julius Rosenberg, an electrical engineer in New York, connected to Soviet handlers. Through coded arrangements outside the laboratory, Greenglass's knowledge of lens shapes and initiator geometry would later reach Moscow. By mid-1944, the laboratory's focus turned to two competing bomb designs: the gun-type uranium device and the implosion-type plutonium weapon. Theoretical divisions calculated critical mass, chemists refined purification methods for plutonium, metallurgists experimented with explosive lenses to achieve symmetrical compression. Each success pushed the project closer to its deadline. Few realized that similar progress was occurring in a parallel ledger maintained by Soviet intelligence. Every report that crossed Fuchs's desk or Greenglass's workbench was, in essence, duplicated in Moscow within weeks. The summer of 1945 brought the first full-scale test. On July 16th, the device codenamed Trinity detonated in the desert south of Los Alamos. The fireball rose with blinding intensity, its light reflecting off the sand turned to glass. Observers recorded data on blast pressure and radiation, but felt something deeper, a sense that science had crossed an irreversible boundary. The explosion validated years of theoretical calculation and delivered the proof that the weapon would work. Within a month, Hiroshima and Nagasaki confirmed its power to the world. The post-war United States celebrated victory and demobilization, unaware that the triumph carried within it a blueprint for its own vulnerability. In 1946 and 1947, congressional committees questioned scientists about political affiliations. The earliest loyalty programs began screening federal employees for subversive ties. Yet few in authority suspected that the essential theft had already occurred. The assumption persisted that security had held. Fuchs returned to Britain, taking a position at the Harwell Atomic Energy Research Establishment. He continued sharing information with his Soviet contacts, providing data on hydrogen bomb feasibility. The material he supplied during and after his time at Los Alamos became the backbone of the Soviet project. By the time he was arrested in 1950, the physical design of the first Soviet bomb was nearly identical to the American implosion device tested at Trinity. Among those still unexamined were Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. During the war, Julius had worked on radar and electronics for the Army Signal Corps before being dismissed for political associations. Afterward, he operated a small machine parts business in New York, outwardly ordinary, but occasionally serving as cover for meetings with former contacts. His role in organizing a network of engineers, sympathetic to Soviet ideals, remained invisible, until Fuchs's confession in Britain led investigators down the chain. The path from Los Alamos back to Knickerbocker Village would soon become clear. Within Los Alamos itself, post-war activity continued under new management. Scientists investigated thermonuclear reactions, seeking a weapon based on fusion rather than fission. Security tightened somewhat, but not enough to erase the habits of wartime informality. Classified documents circulated through internal mail. Safes remained open during working hours. Visitors passed between laboratories with minimal escort. The culture of collaboration that had enabled discovery also left residual vulnerability. When the Soviet test was finally detected, analysts reviewing historical records traced the leak back to this period. Every procedural shortcut, every overlooked background check, every personal sympathy became part of the explanation. The post-mortem concluded that espionage had thrived not because of lax security alone, but because secrecy could never contain belief. The conviction that knowledge should be shared, whether for ideology or humanity, had defeated the walls built to confine. By the time federal investigators began assembling evidence in 1950, Los Alamos existed in two memories: the proud cradle of victory and the origin of betrayal. Veterans of the project faced interviews under oath. Their work was re-examined by people who had not been present. The laboratory that once symbolized scientific triumph now represented a cautionary tale about trust. Every badge photograph, every personnel form, every requisition log became part of the case, file for what would later be called the Atom Spy Ring. The flashback ended with the realization that the secrets of the atom had not been stolen overnight, but over years of cooperation and carelessness. What began on the Mesa in 1943 as a quest to end a war had sown the conditions for another conflict that would last generations. The physicists who had stood before the first atomic fireball could not have known that 6 years later, its reflection would appear over the Kazakh plains, carrying with it the proof that human ingenuity was inseparable from human duplicity. Los Alamos remained under glass, preserved as both monument and warning. Its laboratories continued to hum with research, its fences still guarded, its story retold in classified briefings. But beneath the official narratives of triumph, the quiet understanding persisted among those who had been there, that somewhere between secrecy and science, the line of loyalty had blurred, and in that blur the world had been remade. In the spring of 1943, while scientists worked behind fences in New Mexico, a chemist in Philadelphia began a parallel existence, defined by errands, whose meaning he only partly understood. Harry Gold was 32, trained, methodical, and ordinary, in every visible way. He worked for a food processing firm, analyzing sugar compounds, lived in a modest apartment, and visited his parents on weekends. Yet since 1940, he had been carrying envelopes between strangers, believing he was helping an ally in need. The connections that drew him into Soviet intelligence had formed years earlier, through co-workers who shared political sympathies and believed industrial secrets could accelerate the Soviet economy's recovery from war. Throughout 1943 and 1944, Gold made trips to meet couriers, whose names he never knew. Each encounter followed precise instructions, transmitted through dead drops or coded messages. Times and locations changed constantly. Street corners, hotel lobbies, railway stations. He memorized the appearance of his contacts and the sequence of signals. A newspaper folded a certain way, a phrase exchanged to confirm identity. The packages he received contained film canisters, technical drawings, or handwritten summaries, sealed within layers of waxed paper. He delivered them to other couriers, who moved through the same invisible network. None of them saw the full picture. The system relied on fragmentation, each participant knowing only one step before, one after his own. In late 1944, Gold was directed to meet a physicist newly arrived from Britain. The man was polite, serious, and efficient. The handoff lasted seconds. Gold did not know his name, only that the information came from a laboratory involved in advanced, theoretical work. That physicist was Klaus Fuchs. Over the next year, several similar exchanges occurred. Gold transported notebooks and summaries that would later be identified as key data from Los Alamos, mathematical descriptions of implosion dynamics, neutron initiation sequences, and yield calculations. Each envelope traveled through Gold's hands without his reading its contents. He prided himself on reliability rather than curiosity. The Soviet Residentura in New York considered him a model courier. As the war ended, Gold expected his role to cease. Instead, his superiors expanded the assignments. With victory came a new secrecy around atomic matters, and Moscow's interest only deepened. Gold resumed his laboratory job, but remained on call for errands that arrived without warning. A coded postcard or a knock at his apartment door signaled the next rendezvous. The frequency decreased, but the significance increased. He began using false names when renting hotel rooms and memorized new counter-surveillance routines, checking reflections in shop windows, reversing direction mid-walk, varying the hours of departure. He carried no identification during meetings and used cash for all travel. By 1946, the network around him had thinned as wartime channels collapsed. Several of his previous handlers returned to the Soviet Union, replaced by officials operating under diplomatic cover at the consulate in New York. Gold's assignments now involved fewer intermediaries. He became a direct link between the American sources and their Soviet contacts. One of those sources would soon be identified as David Greenglass. Through Greenglass, the Bureau would later trace the line to Julius Rosenberg. At the time, however, Gold remained unaware of most of the names behind the paper he carried. The tradecraft evolved as security tightened across federal laboratories. Instead of bulky documents, agents relied on microfilm. Gold learned to handle small canisters, hidden in everyday objects. A hollowed-out pen, a tube of shaving cream, the lining of a wallet. Transfers occurred in moments that appeared accidental. A briefcase brushed against another on a subway platform, a parcel left on a park bench. He maintained meticulous records in his mind, never on paper. The effort to remain anonymous eroded his sense of identity. Each mission blurred into the next. He was a chemist by profession, a courier by necessity, and a ghost by design. In 1947, as Cold War tension replaced wartime alliance, the atmosphere surrounding his work changed. Reports of Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe and the Truman Doctrine's proclamation of containment made cooperation with Moscow politically toxic. Gold understood that his assignments now carried the risk of treason, rather than idealism. Yet he continued, partly from inertia, partly from fear of betraying those who had trusted him. He rationalized that the material he delivered concerned technology already known to the Soviets, or that peace required parity. Self-justification became his only defense against anxiety. The FBI's counterintelligence divisions, meanwhile, increased monitoring of suspected Soviet operatives. Wiretaps on diplomatic communications produced fragments of coded traffic, referencing an American courier, known only by a numerical designation. Cryptanalysts at Arlington Hall, and later at the newly formed Armed Forces Security Agency, began deciphering the messages. Project Venona, as it was called, eventually revealed hundreds of Soviet intelligence cables from the war years. Among them were references that would later match Gold's activities. But in 1947, those decrypts were incomplete, and his name remained hidden behind code words. In early 1949, Gold's routine began to falter. Some of his previous contacts disappeared without explanation. The political climate had hardened. The Communist Party faced internal divisions and government scrutiny. He noticed surveillance in places that had once been empty, men lingering near payphones, or following him from streetcars. Whether real or imagined, the pressure grew. When news reached the public that the Soviet Union had tested an atomic bomb, Gold understood the significance at once. The information he had carried had reached its destination. What he did not know was that British intelligence had already begun questioning Klaus Fuchs about leaks from the wartime project. Fuchs's interrogation in London during January 1950 produced a confession that rippled across the Atlantic. He described his meetings with an American courier, giving enough detail for the FBI to identify Gold. Within weeks, Bureau agents were watching his movements in Philadelphia, documenting his commute, his correspondence, and his visitors. They knew his habits, the time he left work, the path he took home, the corner store where he bought his newspaper. The surveillance was patient, designed to build an unbroken chain of evidence before confrontation. When agents finally approached him in May 1950, Gold's reaction confirmed their suspicions. Under questioning, he admitted to serving as an intermediary for Fuchs, but insisted that his motive had been to assist an ally during the war. He surrendered willingly and provided a detailed statement of his activities. From memory, he reconstructed years of contacts, dates and locations, giving investigators a roadmap that led directly to David Greenglass. The Bureau cross-checked his account against travel records and intercepted communications, finding them consistent. Gold's cooperation transformed the investigation from speculation to certainty. His confession illustrated how the espionage network had functioned without central coordination, yet achieved precision through discipline. Each courier operated independently, guided by simple principles of security: limited knowledge, compartmentalized contact, and trust in procedure. The Soviets had built a system that could withstand the loss of individual agents, because no one person possessed the whole structure. Only when multiple confessions overlapped did the pattern emerge. Gold's capture marked the pivot between the invisible phase of espionage and the public spectacle that would follow. The FBI now possessed testimony linking Fuchs in Britain to Greenglass in New Mexico and to Julius Rosenberg in New York. It was the connective tissue the Bureau had lacked. Agents began verifying each lead, tracing the flow of information from Los Alamos workshops to Soviet handlers. The process involved thousands of hours of cross-referencing statements, reconstructing timelines, and aligning them with decoded messages from Venona. Every confirmation strengthened the case for prosecution. While Gold remained in custody, the Bureau dissected his life. They examined his bank accounts, letters, and employment records, searching for signs of payment or coercion. The absence of substantial financial gain supported the interpretation of ideological motivation. This detail would later help prosecutors present the espionage network as driven by conviction rather than greed, deepening the moral dimension of the crime. In a society newly anxious about loyalty, such conviction appeared even more dangerous than money. Meanwhile, international repercussions unfolded. British intelligence, embarrassed by Fuchs's betrayal, tightened security at its atomic research centers. In Canada, authorities revisited the earlier Gouzenko defection of 1945, recognizing its warnings about Soviet penetration had been accurate. In the United States, the Attorney General authorized expanded authority for the FBI to investigate scientific personnel. Universities began screening research staff for political reliability. The shadow of Gold's confession extended far beyond his own case. Within months, his cooperation led to the arrest of David Greenglass. Investigators confronted Greenglass with evidence that his wartime machine shop experience at Los Alamos matched descriptions in Gold's statement. They obtained corroboration from travel records and intercepted communications. Greenglass eventually identified Julius Rosenberg as the person who had encouraged him to share information. The chain was now complete, from Fuchs's equations, to Gold's envelopes, to Greenglass's blueprints, to Rosenberg's network in New York. The Soviet bomb's design, lineage, could be traced across continents and years. For the FBI, the success validated years of counterintelligence reform. The Bureau's meticulous documentation turned the invisible into evidence admissible in court. For the public, however, the revelations were shocking. Newspapers reported each arrest as a revelation of hidden enemies within. The perception that ordinary Americans had conspired to give away the nation's ultimate weapon intensified fear and suspicion. Political leaders used the moment to justify broader loyalty investigations, while scientists faced renewed scrutiny over their international contacts. Harry Gold remained imprisoned. As the trials unfolded, his earlier anonymity replaced by notoriety. He became a symbol of misplaced idealism, a man who had believed in scientific brotherhood and discovered too late the political cost. His testimony was factual and unemotional, matching Bureau records with precision. Though he insisted he had never acted for profit, the law regarded intent as irrelevant. The act of transmission itself defined guilt. His sentence reflected both punishment and deterrence. The network he had served ceased to exist, dismantled by confession and arrest. Yet its legacy endured in the altered architecture of American secrecy. From that point onward, the handling of classified material would operate under stricter control, shaped by the lessons drawn from his case. Every clearance process, every loyalty review, every security briefing traced its lineage to the fear that another courier might one day walk unnoticed through the heart of national defense. By the end of 1950, the FBI considered the atomic espionage investigation substantially resolved. The principal links had been exposed. Prosecutions were underway, but the broader implications were only beginning. The existence of men like Gold demonstrated that espionage need not depend on professional spies. It could rely on ordinary citizens, persuaded by conscience or ideology. This realization altered American intelligence strategy permanently. Counter-espionage expanded from guarding documents to scrutinizing motives. The psychological dimensions of loyalty became as important as physical security. In retrospect, the courier system that had once appeared sophisticated now looked fragile, dependent on human reliability in a world growing less forgiving. Its success had rested on the complacency of institutions that valued scientific progress over political vigilance. Gold's unremarkable appearance, his modest lifestyle, his devotion to routine, all had served as camouflage more effective than any disguise. The danger he represented was precisely his normality. As the decade advanced, the echo of his actions persisted. The trial of the Rosenbergs in 1951 drew on evidence first uncovered through his confession. Each document presented in court bore the invisible trace of his earlier journeys through railway stations and hotel lobbies. While the proceedings focused on larger questions of guilt and punishment, the foundation remained the simple fact of transport, the physical movement of paper from one hand to another. The courier's path had become the spine of history's case, against its own faith in secrecy. By the time the verdicts were rendered, Harry Gold had faded from headlines, confined to a federal penitentiary, studying chemistry textbooks in his cell. Outside, the Cold War intensified, and the hydrogen bomb program accelerated. The world he had helped shape through unintended service no longer required human couriers. It had entered an age of espionage, defined by machines, codes, and satellites. Yet every advance in secrecy carried a memory of him, a reminder that even in an era of technology, betrayal often began with belief and a willingness to deliver a sealed envelope to a stranger. In the months after Harry Gold's confession, federal agents turned their attention toward the machinist he had named. David Greenglass lived with his wife Ruth in a small apartment in Albuquerque, far removed from the laboratories of his wartime service. His name appeared in military employment rosters from Los Alamos, attached to the machine shop responsible for fabricating high-precision components used in experimental assemblies. At first, his role had seemed routine: cutting metal, aligning jigs, maintaining tolerances within thousandths of an inch. Yet the parts he handled belonged to the inner structure of the implosion device. The information he retained in memory represented a direct map to the bomb's mechanical heart. By early 1945, the Soviet Residentura in New York had lost several wartime sources as operations were curtailed. The intelligence officers needed new access to the atomic project, and Julius Rosenberg appeared willing to assist. He understood the value of a relative positioned inside the installation where the bomb was being built. Communication with David and Ruth occurred through carefully arranged intermediaries. Ruth acted as messenger, visiting her husband at Los Alamos, under the pretext of family reunion. During those visits, she conveyed requests for technical descriptions and instructions for the method of transfer. No documents were removed from the laboratory. The information moved through sketches and memory. David Greenglass possessed neither advanced education nor deep theoretical understanding, but his practical observations were precise. He knew the arrangement of explosive lenses, the materials used in initiators, and the dimensions of casings he had machined. He memorized sequences of assembly and reproduced them later on paper for delivery to the Rosenbergs. The drawings he produced were crude yet sufficient to convey the concept of symmetrical implosion. Combined with data from other sources, they confirmed for Soviet scientists the feasibility of the design. In the broader espionage mosaic, his contribution formed a vital mechanical layer beneath the theoretical framework supplied by Klaus Fuchs. The flow of information followed a pattern already established through Harry Gold. Once Ruth obtained the sketches and notes from her husband, she carried them back to New York. There the material passed to Julius Rosenberg, who retyped or redrew it to remove identifying marks before transferring it to his own Soviet contact. Each step introduced distance between the origin and the endpoint. When Gold received the final envelope for delivery, he had no means of knowing it originated from a soldier in New Mexico. The system's strength lay in its isolation. After the war, David Greenglass left military service and returned to New York. He found employment as a machinist and settled again with Ruth. Life resumed ordinary rhythms, but the secret history between them persisted. They maintained occasional contact with the Rosenbergs, sharing family meals and political conversation. The world outside their apartment changed rapidly. Germany surrendered, Japan fell, and the alliance with the Soviet Union dissolved into rivalry. Loyalty became a question with legal consequences. Yet within the family, old wartime sympathies lingered, sustained by memory and ideology. In 1947 and 1948, the FBI began reviewing the backgrounds of former Manhattan Project personnel. His name resurfaced with annotation referencing his family connection to Julius Rosenberg. From that moment, surveillance became continuous. Agents monitored his movements, telephone calls, and mail. They recorded visits from relatives, noting the dates Ruth traveled to New York. Field reports described a cautious couple, outwardly conventional, with no signs of extravagant spending or sudden income. Investigators understood that ideological espionage seldom produced financial evidence. The absence of profit was not exculpatory. It was characteristic. In May 1950, with corroboration from Gold's statements, the Bureau obtained warrants for questioning. Greenglass was taken into custody at his workplace and transported for interrogation. Under controlled conditions, he faced questions about his time at Los Alamos, his relationship to Julius Rosenberg, and his knowledge of Harry Gold. The evidence against him consisted primarily of Gold's testimony and partial decrypts from Soviet cables. At first he denied involvement, describing himself as a loyal soldier who had performed routine mechanical tasks. Investigators confronted him with specific details, from the intercepted communications, dates of meetings, descriptions of packages, and references that matched his schedule. The precision of those facts eroded his resistance. Within days he admitted to supplying information during the war, framing his actions as assistance to an ally rather than betrayal. The confession implicated Julius Rosenberg directly. Greenglass described how his sister Ethel had typed notes while Julius prepared summaries for transmission. These statements formed the core of the government's subsequent case. The Bureau verified his account through surveillance of the Rosenbergs' correspondence and analysis of handwriting and typewriter evidence. Each new confirmation tightened the net. By July 1950, Julius Rosenberg was arrested, followed weeks later by Ethel. The family network, that had once exchanged sketches and typed pages around a kitchen table, became the center of the most consequential espionage prosecution in American history. For investigators, the Greenglass testimony served multiple purposes. It explained how mechanical data from Los Alamos complemented theoretical calculations from Fuchs. It demonstrated the existence of a coordinated effort rather than isolated acts, and it provided a narrative accessible to the public, ordinary citizens, transferring the nation's greatest secret through domestic familiarity. The story's simplicity made it powerful. Behind it, the Bureau's case relied on meticulous corroboration, timelines, material evidence, and coded intercepts. But the human element anchored it in public imagination. During the months that followed, Greenglass remained in protective custody, alternating between cooperation and apprehension. For the FBI, the unraveling of the Greenglass thread validated years of counter-espionage effort. The Bureau documented every stage from recruitment to confession, creating a case study for future training. It demonstrated that espionage did not require dramatic theft or coercion, only access, opportunity, and conviction. The Los Alamos breach became a model for understanding internal security failures. In subsequent years, military and civilian agencies would apply its lessons through exhaustive background checks and loyalty screenings that reached into classrooms and laboratories alike. David Greenglass's role concluded with sentencing in 1951. His cooperation spared him the harshest penalty, but confined him to prison for years. Ruth avoided prosecution in exchange for testimony. The moral calculus of justice divided families and opinions. Some viewed the leniency as necessary to secure conviction of higher figures. Others saw it as evidence of coercion. Regardless of interpretation, the legal outcome was irreversible. The machinery of prosecution had moved from investigation to punishment, propelled by the momentum of national fear. Within the scientific community, the case deepened divisions. Former Manhattan Project veterans faced renewed security reviews, and loyalty boards scrutinized political histories, stretching back decades. Laboratories adopted closed-door policies, limiting collaboration and international exchange. The openness that had fueled wartime innovation dissolved under suspicion. Each researcher became a potential risk to be measured and contained. The intellectual freedom that had once defined American science contracted beneath the weight of security clearances and classified protocols. The Greenglass affair also influenced public policy. Legislators cited it to justify the Internal Security Act of 1950 and other measures, expanding surveillance authority. The image of the machinist spy, modest yet dangerous, became part of political rhetoric, supporting stricter control over information. In popular culture, radio dramas and newsreels transformed the narrative into cautionary parable, vigilance against hidden subversion. The real participants, meanwhile, receded into prisons and guarded anonymity. By the time the Rosenbergs went to trial in 1951, David Greenglass had completed his transformation from participant to witness. His testimony filled the courtroom transcripts that would later be dissected by historians and lawyers. His recollections, though inconsistent in detail, aligned with the government's broader structure of evidence. The drawings he once made on scrap paper in Los Alamos workshops became exhibits displayed before jurors. Their crude lines illustrated the pathway from an isolated mesa to global nuclear parity. In retrospect, the Greenglass thread represented the bridge between science and ideology, between laboratory secrecy and political conviction. It revealed how the most guarded project in history could be undone by trust misplaced within personal networks. The story contained no master spies or dramatic infiltrations, only family ties, shared beliefs, and quiet decisions repeated over time. Its outcome reshaped not only national security, but the moral landscape of an age. When historians later traced the chronology of atomic espionage, they found that every stage led inevitably through the Greenglass connection. Without his machine shop memory, Soviet engineers might have required years to perfect their own implosion system. Without his confession, the Rosenberg prosecution might have lacked its anchor. Between those extremes lay the paradox of his life. The same act that accelerated one nation's power ensured another's destruction. In the records of the FBI and the courts, his name appears not as hero or villain, but as evidence, an entry in the chain that defined the Cold War's opening chapter. The investigation that began with seismic readings in 1949 had now reached the intimate level of family, closing the circle from the global to the domestic. The secrets once forged in desert laboratories had traveled through kitchens, apartments, and ordinary streets. With the completion of this thread, the case of atomic espionage stood ready for its final transformation. From inquiry to trial, from secrecy to spectacle, from the hidden mechanics of betrayal to the public theater of justice. By 1950, the brick towers of Knickerbocker Village, on Manhattan's Lower East Side, stood as a modest symbol of working-class stability. The courtyards echoed with children's laughter, laundry swayed above narrow alleys, and tenants came and went under the rhythm of post-war life. Behind one of those apartment doors, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg maintained an existence that looked indistinguishable from thousands of other young families, rebuilding after years of war. A sewing machine occupied the kitchen table. A radio murmured evening news between advertisements. Neighbors remembered them as quiet, attentive to their two small sons, deliberate in their habits. Yet within that routine, a current of secrecy pulsed, something invisible yet disciplined, something that had begun long before the birth of their children, and now drew inexorably toward exposure. Julius Rosenberg had entered adulthood with technical ambition and political certainty. Born to immigrant parents who believed education was the only ladder from poverty, he had pursued electrical engineering through Depression-era hardship. College introduced him not only to circuits and mathematics, but to a generation of idealists, convinced that economic injustice could be corrected through collective action. The campus cells of the Young Communist League offered purpose when jobs were scarce and fascism spread abroad. He found in that movement a combination of intellectual clarity and moral mission that endured even after most of his classmates drifted away. The party's language, justice, solidarity, equality, became his creed, while its discipline shaped the precision that later defined his clandestine work. Marriage to Ethel Greenglass, in 1939, bound him to a partner whose convictions mirrored his own. She had pursued an early career in clerical work and amateur theater before devoting herself to domestic life. Her intellect was sharp, her temperament serious, and she shared Julius's belief that socialism offered humanity's only rational course. When war came, both regarded the alliance with the Soviet Union as proof of history's direction. To them, aiding that ally through information sharing was not treason, but participation in a global struggle for peace. The distinction between patriotism and ideology dissolved beneath that conviction. During the war, Julius obtained a position with the Army Signal Corps Engineering Laboratories at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. The work granted him access to radar and communications research, vital to military operations. Within that laboratory environment, he recognized opportunities for the movement he still privately served. He approached colleagues who expressed sympathy for socialist ideals, cultivating friendships that concealed recruitment. Technical data, component lists, design specifications, test results moved quietly from secure files to microfilm and summary notes. Each item seemed minor. Together they illustrated the functioning of America's emerging electronic warfare capacity. Julius built his network patiently, trusting that the cause justified the risk. After the war ended, and his government position was terminated for political associations, he transferred his engineering skills to private manufacturing. Outwardly, he became a small business owner, producing electrical parts. Inwardly, he continued contact with his Soviet handler, maintaining the discipline of coded meetings and cautious communication. His home on Monroe Street doubled as a covert office, where information was consolidated and prepared for transmission. Typewritten pages, diagrams and identification lists were composed at night, after the children slept. Ethel Rosenberg managed the domestic veil that kept suspicion away. She entertained neighbors, paid rent promptly, and projected an image of ordinary respectability. By 1950, those consequences arrived at the Rosenbergs' doorstep. Harry Gold's confession had traced the path of espionage with relentless logic. The Greenglass admissions pointed directly toward Julius. Surveillance teams established positions near Knickerbocker Village, observing comings and goings from dawn to midnight. Postal inspectors coordinated with the FBI to monitor correspondence. Undercover agents recorded the movements of anyone who visited the apartment. Reports noted the precision with which Julius conducted his daily routine, leaving at fixed hours, meeting acquaintances in cafes, returning with packages whose contents could not yet be identified. The Bureau knew that patience mattered more than confrontation. Every additional observation tightened the evidentiary chain. On July 17, 1950, at 7 p.m., agents entered Knickerbocker Village and executed the warrant. Julius Rosenberg was taken quietly, his hands cuffed as tenants peered from doorways. The search of the apartment yielded little tangible material. No blueprints, no microfilm, no coded messages. But the absence itself became suspicious. Rooms too orderly, papers too carefully arranged, signaled deliberate concealment. Ethel Rosenberg remained with the children, while agents completed their inventory. The arrest report listed her as potential accomplice, further investigation pending. For the Bureau, the objective shifted from discovery to consolidation. Agents examined Julius's business records, traced bank deposits, and interviewed every known associate. They found evidence of political meetings during the late 1930s, petitions signed in support of left-wing causes, and correspondence with individuals already identified as members of the Communist Party. Each document added context for prosecutors, who would argue motive through ideology. Technicians analyzed the typewriter, seized from the apartment, comparing its output with the typed notes described by David Greenglass. The mechanical alignment of letters and spacing patterns produced a match sufficient to satisfy investigators that Ethel had retyped espionage material. The typewriter became Exhibit A in the narrative of domestic conspiracy. Meanwhile, Ethel's role expanded under scrutiny. When she appeared before the grand jury in August 1950, her measured refusal to answer questions strengthened the government's suspicion. Prosecutors interpreted her silence as defiance rather than caution. Within days, she too was indicted, and both husband and wife were confined under separate supervision. Their children were placed with relatives, becoming unintentional witnesses to the consequences of ideology colliding with state power. From a bureaucratic perspective, the Rosenberg case advanced through predictable stages: indictment, arraignment, pre-trial motions. Behind the paperwork, however, agents and prosecutors recognized its symbolic weight. This was not merely another espionage file. It was the demonstration of American vigilance at a time when the Soviet Union had achieved nuclear parity. Success demanded thoroughness. The Attorney General's office coordinated directly with J. Edgar Hoover, who followed each development through nightly reports. The Bureau's hierarchy treated the case as both investigation and message, proof that internal betrayal would be uncovered regardless of ideology's disguise. Within the government, analysts examined the case for patterns that could predict future threats. They noted that the Rosenbergs operated without monetary gain, relying instead on ideological motivation. This insight influenced later counterintelligence doctrine, emphasizing psychological screening over financial surveillance. Loyalty programs expanded across agencies, reaching into universities and defense contractors. The fear of another Knickerbocker Village shaped security policy. By early 1951, preparations for trial neared completion. Prosecutors assembled witness lists, headed by David and Ruth Greenglass, and by Max Ellicher. Each had his or her own reasons for cooperating: self-preservation, ideological distance, or fear. Their testimony would frame Julius and Ethel as central figures in a network that extended from New York to Los Alamos and beyond. The narrative was ready: the modest apartment overlooking Monroe Street as the hub of atomic espionage. On the eve of trial, the FBI's internal summary outlined the sequence of betrayal as a closed circle. Fuchs had provided theory. Greenglass had provided mechanics. The Rosenbergs had coordinated and transmitted. Together they constituted the composite image of subversion that haunted post-war America. Within that schema, Knickerbocker Village served not merely as residence, but as symbol of infiltration, the enemy within ordinary walls. As winter gave way to spring, the courthouse prepared for proceedings that would draw international attention. The nation that once celebrated scientific triumph now confronted the moral shadow cast by that achievement. In the quiet of their separate cells, Julius and Ethel waited, each sustained by conviction that the cause they had served remained just, even if misunderstood. Outside, the world arranged itself into alliances and hostilities that would define generations. The story, rooted in a single apartment complex, now belonged to history. The courthouse at Foley Square rose like a fortress of marble and authority, its corridors echoing with footsteps and the murmur of anticipation. In March 1951, it became the center of a national reckoning. The Rosenberg Sobel case was assigned to the Southern District of New York, a venue that had witnessed racketeering and wartime espionage before, but nothing with implications so vast. The defendants were charged not only with conspiracy to commit espionage, but with violating the unwritten boundaries of loyalty, at a time when the Cold War had hardened into ideology. Each morning, reporters gathered outside in the cold, their notebooks ready to capture the spectacle that would define an era. The government's case unfolded with mechanical precision. Prosecutors began by outlining the chain of transmission that linked Los Alamos to Moscow. They traced it through Fuchs, Gold, and the Greenglasses, constructing a timeline that left little room for ambiguity. The presentation combined documents, photographs, and testimony into a narrative of conspiracy operating within the domestic sphere. Charts displayed the flow of information from scientist to courier to handler, each arrow terminating at the Rosenbergs' address in Knickerbocker Village. The logic was linear, designed to leave jurors with the sense that betrayal could be charted like engineering. The first witnesses were technical, establishing the scientific importance of the stolen data. Physicists described the uniqueness of the implosion method and the potential impact of its disclosure. Their tone was clinical, but their words underscored the magnitude of the loss. Jurors listened as terms like critical mass and plutonium compression filled the air. These details, incomprehensible to most, carried weight through repetition and authority. Each explained that the drawings delivered by Green Glass could have shortened another nation's path to the bomb by years. That assertion, more than any moral argument, defined the gravity of the crime. After the experts came, the human chain of evidence, Harry Gold took the stand, escorted under heavy guard. His appearance represented the hinge between theoretical betrayal and tangible proof. He recounted his travels during the war years, the coded instructions, the transfers of envelopes in cities and train stations. Every name he uttered tightened the circle around the accused. The courtroom remained still, except for the scratching of pens and the faint click of typewriter keys from the press benches. Gold's past as a chemist, his awkward demeanor, his steady account of routine espionage transactions, gave the proceedings an unsettling normalcy. Treason appeared methodical, rather than dramatic. Next came David Greenglass. His entry carried an invisible weight that pressed against the walls of the courtroom. His testimony linked blood to betrayal, turning a family dispute into a matter of state. The prosecution guided him through recollection of wartime events, his assignments in the Los Alamos machine shops, his contact with Julius, and the passing of sketches. Each statement was reinforced by physical exhibits, drawings, letters, and the typewritten pages that matched the family's typewriter. The prosecution displayed them under glass, inviting jurors to consider the tangible evidence of conspiracy. The image of a sister and brother, exchanging secrets of national defense, became the trial's central tableau. The government introduced exhibits with procedural ceremony, typed pages, hand-drawn schematics, and pieces of cardboard, identified as recognition tokens. Each item passed through the hands of clerks, attorneys, and marshals before being placed before the jury. The accumulation of paper and objects transformed abstract accusation into visible substance. By the time closing arguments approached, the table before the judge was crowded with physical symbols of guilt. Beyond the courthouse, the world reacted with intensity. Left-leaning organizations denounced the trial as political theater. Anti-communist groups hailed it as overdue justice. Demonstrations formed in city squares, petitions circulated through universities and labor unions. The ideological divide of the early 1950s found its symbol in this courtroom drama. Yet within the walls of Foley Square, the process remained disciplined and methodical. The judge enforced decorum, the jurors listened, and the machinery of law moved forward at its own unyielding pace. By the end of March, closing statements drew the threads together. The prosecution summarized the case as proof that the defendants had conspired to deliver atomic information to the Soviet Union between 1944 and 1950. They argued that motive was irrelevant. Intent and effect were sufficient. The defense emphasized lack of direct evidence and the unreliability of key witnesses. But the broader narrative had already solidified in the jurors' minds. A chain of events beginning with the theft of secrets and ending with the detonation of a foreign bomb. The timing made coincidence unthinkable. The jury retired to deliberate on the evening of March 28. Outside, crowds gathered behind police barriers, pressed against the cold metal railings that lined the courthouse steps. Reporters waited with flashbulbs, ready, aware that whatever verdict emerged would reverberate around the world. Inside the jury room, 12 citizens weighed the evidence, the climate of fear, and the judge's instructions. Hours passed before the decision crystallized. On March 29, 1951, the foreman announced the verdict, guilty on all major counts. The announcement sent a wave through the courtroom that no official could contain. Spectators shifted, reporters rushed for telephones, and guards tightened formation around the defendants. The judge scheduled sentencing for April 5, granting the interim week for formal motions. Yet the emotional sentence had already been delivered in public perception. To millions, the Rosenbergs had crossed the moral boundary that defined the post-war world. To others, they had become victims of hysteria. The polarization ensured that the case would outlive everyone in the room. The sentencing day arrived beneath heavy security. Metal detectors framed the courthouse entrances, and plainclothes agents mingled with the crowd. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued, ritualistic, almost clerical. The judge read from prepared text, explaining that the crime exceeded ordinary espionage because it involved the transmission of information that could alter the balance of global power. The conclusion was absolute. Death in the electric chair for Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. 30 years imprisonment for Morton Sobel. No further words were required. The gavel marked the transition from deliberation to consequence. After the verdict, appeals began immediately. Defense attorneys filed motions, citing procedural errors, insufficient evidence, and questions regarding the applicability of wartime statutes. Each appeal traveled through the hierarchy of courts. Each was denied. The legal process became a mechanical repetition, the same documents rephrased, The same signatures reapplied. Public debate intensified with every rejection. Intellectuals abroad compared the proceedings to political trials in Europe. American officials dismissed such criticism as propaganda. The case crossed national borders through headlines translated into multiple languages. The names of the defendants became shorthand for moral argument on every continent. Within the FBI, the conclusion of trial represented both victory and validation. Decades of internal security policy seemed justified. Memos circulated emphasizing the importance of loyalty investigations and surveillance coordination. Training manuals incorporated the Rosenberg case as exemplar, illustrating how patience and evidence could overcome denial. The Bureau's director referenced it repeatedly in speeches, citing it as proof that infiltration would always be met with exposure. The narrative became institutional memory, preserved in briefings and archives. For the defendants, confinement began a new phase. Separate cells, restricted correspondence, limited visitation. They continued to maintain innocence, submitting letters to their attorney and appeals to the public. Outside the prison walls, committees formed to advocate clemency, arguing that evidence had been exaggerated and motives misrepresented. Supporters rallied in front of courthouses, holding signs demanding mercy. Opponents gathered across the street, demanding execution. The case had transcended its legal boundaries. It had become a referendum on fear itself. By early 1953, the legal avenues narrowed to a final petition for clemency. The president received reports from the Attorney General, summaries from the FBI, and pleas from international organizations. Each document reinforced the official position that justice had been properly served. The president's response, later released to the public, emphasized that the Rosenbergs' actions had betrayed the cause of freedom. The tone was resolute, final. With that decision, the legal chapter of the trial closed, and the historical one began. The courthouse at Foley Square returned to routine business, but the echoes of that trial lingered in its marble halls. Future generations would pass through, unaware of the hours of testimony once recorded there. The sketches under glass, the reporters hunched over typewriters, capturing history as it happened. The trial had transformed law into theater, evidence into ideology, and two individuals into enduring controversy. In that transformation lay the essence of the early Cold War, the collision of belief and fear within a system that demanded certainty even when truth remained elusive. The trial ended, but the machinery of its consequences had only begun. In April 1951, as the courtroom lights dimmed and reporters dispersed, the case entered the labyrinth of appellate procedure. Legal documents replaced testimony. The language of guilt became the language of precedent. In the offices of defense attorneys, typewriters clattered through the night as motions for a new trial were prepared. The first appeal challenged the admissibility of key testimony and questioned whether the death sentence was permissible under statutes written for wartime. The petition moved upward through the judicial hierarchy, each level responding with deliberation that masked inevitability. The courts affirmed the convictions. The reasoning was consistent. The evidence supported the verdict. Procedure had been followed. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were transferred from the Federal House of Detention in Manhattan to Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York. There, under the gray architecture of the Hudson Valley Penitentiary, their lives contracted into regulated hours. Mornings began with inspections, meals under guard, exercise in walled yards, letters written on lined paper. The routines were unremarkable, yet each gesture carried the weight of waiting. Their isolation became part of the sentence, long before the state fulfilled it. Prison officials recorded conduct as orderly and cooperative. The couple's refusal to confess, even under the possibility of commutation, set them apart from other inmates. In the language of administration, they were non-admitting prisoners, a phrase that reduced ideology to paperwork. In the world beyond the prison, the Cold War intensified. American troops fought in Korea. Hydrogen bomb tests prepared in the Pacific. The Rosenbergs case became shorthand for the domestic front of that global struggle. Politicians cited it in speeches supporting internal security laws. The names of the condemned appeared alongside phrases like national vigilance and moral strength. School books warned of espionage. Films dramatized loyalty. The couple existed simultaneously as living prisoners and symbolic cautionary figures. The boundary between their bodies and their legend blurred. Within Sing Sing, the warden maintained precise records of their conduct. Julius worked in the prison library, cataloging volumes under the dim light of iron-barred windows. Ethel spent hours in the women's section, sewing and reading. They communicated through letters screened by censors and occasional supervised visits separated by glass. Each encounter occurred under observation, timed and documented. The physical distance between them mirrored the political gulf outside. Two lives enclosed by systems larger than themselves. In December 1952, their attorneys petitioned the president for executive clemency. The file included testimonials from religious leaders, legal scholars, and foreign heads of state. The Department of Justice prepared a detailed memorandum summarizing the case, reaffirming that the Rosenbergs' actions had endangered the nation's security at the most critical moment of the century. The president reviewed the documents, consulted advisors, and declined to intervene. The date of execution was set for June 1953. Notification reached the couple through formal letter, written in bureaucratic neutrality that contrasted with the finality of its content. Within the prison, preparations proceeded according to protocol. Electricians tested the chair in advance. Guards rehearsed procedures. Chaplains were notified. The condemned were informed of visiting rights and final arrangements. Each step followed an established routine used for other prisoners. But the presence of reporters outside the gates transformed it into a global event. The execution chamber, a small brick-lined room known as the death house, became the focal point of attention, far beyond the prison walls. On the evening of June 19, 1953, the sequence of events unfolded with precision measured in minutes. Witnesses from the press and state agencies assembled in a narrow corridor outside the chamber. Security officers lined the perimeter of the prison. Within the cells, the Rosenbergs prepared privately. Adhering to the composure that had characterized them since arrest, they left behind letters to their children, expressing conviction that history would judge differently. At 8 p.m., officials carried out the sentence. The record lists the time of death for Julius Rosenberg as 8:06 p.m. for Ethel Rosenberg as 8:17 p.m. The documentation filled several pages. Electrical readings, medical certification, signatures. The language remained clinical, yet it marked the end of the most publicized execution of the century. Outside Sing Sing's gates, thousands stood in silence as the prison lights flickered. Some prayed, some chanted, others simply watched. The air carried the heavy stillness of an event too vast for comprehension. News bulletins crossed time zones within minutes. Radio networks interrupted programming to announce that the sentences had been carried out. Across continents, listeners paused over dinner tables, factories, and university halls to absorb the finality of the news. The couple whose names had dominated headlines for 3 years were now figures of history. In the hours that followed, reactions divided along ideological lines. Government officials emphasized justice fulfilled and national security preserved. Critics mourned what they saw as state vengeance. Foreign newspapers printed photographs of candlelight vigils and protests at American embassies. The moral argument that had begun in the courtroom now extended to philosophy and theology. To one side, the executions affirmed that betrayal demanded absolute punishment. To the other, they exposed the perils of fear overwhelming fairness. The debate outlived the moment itself. The Rosenbergs were buried in New York, under the same summer sky that had framed their arrest 3 years earlier. At the funeral, crowds stretched for blocks, mingling grief with defiance. Plainclothes officers observed from rooftops, noting the presence of political banners among the mourners. Speakers recited tributes, portraying the couple as martyrs to conscience. The event concluded without incident, yet its imagery entered the iconography of the Cold War. Photographs of coffins draped in flowers beneath flags of divided allegiance. In the years that followed, declassified documents, decoded cables, and scholarly studies continued to revisit the case. Some findings confirmed elements of espionage. Others questioned the extent of guilt. The debate oscillated between certainty and doubt, reflecting the tension of an era when secrecy and truth seldom coincided. For historians, the appeal records, prison logs, and diplomatic cables formed a portrait of a society struggling to define justice amid ideological war. The Rosenbergs' silence, maintained until death, became the most eloquent evidence left behind. The story that had begun in hidden laboratories ended in an execution chamber, yet its influence radiated outward into law, culture, and conscience. The appeals had failed, but the silence persisted. In letters preserved, in photographs studied, in debates renewed by each generation that discovered the file anew. The nation that killed them also immortalized them, not through celebration, but through the unresolved question they left behind. Where does loyalty end and belief begin? Within months of the Rosenbergs' deaths, Washington strengthened every wall that guarded its scientific secrets. The Atomic Energy Act amendments of 1954 created layers of clearance and background investigation, deeper than anything the Manhattan District had known. Laboratories once defined by open exchange of ideas adopted compartments of classification. Every visitor signed multiple forms. Every file moved under escort. Scientists who had grown within the collaborative atmosphere of wartime research found themselves constrained by bureaucratic fences. The language of discovery became fused with the vocabulary of security. Curiosity was tolerated only when loyal. The political atmosphere of the early 1950s intensified this transformation. Senator McCarthy's committees demanded names, affiliations, and confessions. The Rosenberg case provided precedent and warning. It demonstrated how ideology could be prosecuted as espionage. Universities dismissed faculty whose opinions deviated from official narratives. Laboratories required loyalty oaths, before access to reactors or cyclotrons. The fear of subversion became professional currency. In this environment, scientific progress continued, yet it did so under the constant supervision of suspicion. Writers, artists, and filmmakers began turning the Rosenberg story into metaphor. Plays portrayed the couple as tragic emblems of conscience. Novels reimagined them within composite characters torn between ideology and survival. Painters used their faces to express the anxiety of the nuclear age. Even those who rejected their politics recognized the power of their silence. They had died without confession, leaving the question of guilt unresolved. In that ambiguity, creative minds found reflection of their own era's uncertainty. The couple became symbols not of espionage alone, but of the collision between private belief and public demand for conformity. Broad, the moral resonance of the case evolved into political currency. Soviet propaganda used the executions to illustrate what it called capitalist hypocrisy, distributing posters depicting the Rosenbergs as victims of class hatred in newly independent nations of Asia and Africa. Their names appeared in speeches advocating resistance to Western dominance. The couple who had once lived quietly in a Manhattan apartment now existed as icons across continents they had never seen. Their story, filtered through ideology, became part of the global narrative of injustice. At home, the scientific community wrestled with conscience. Many who had worked at Los Alamos returned to universities, determined to separate research from warfare. Oppenheimer himself, once hailed as father of the atomic bomb, faced hearings that stripped his clearance in 1954. His interrogation mirrored the same questions of loyalty and belief that had defined the Rosenbergs' ordeal. The line between inquiry and inquisition blurred again. Scientists learned that ideas carried political risk, that equations could be interpreted as allegiance. The shadow of espionage had transformed into an instrument of control. In 1956, the release of the first Soviet memoirs, referencing wartime intelligence, revived debate. Western analysts discovered fragments confirming that Fuchs had indeed supplied data crucial to the bomb's design. The realization reframed the Rosenbergs' role. Perhaps participants, perhaps accessories, but not masterminds. The absolute moral clarity sought in 1951 dissolved into historical complexity. The execution remained irreversible. Interpretation became fluid. Each decade redrafted its verdict. By the 1960s, their sons, adopted by relatives, reached adulthood under new names. They carried fragments of memory and a determination to redefine their parents' story. Public appearances and books reopened debate at moments when the world seemed poised between memory and reform. The Vietnam War and civil rights movements reshaped perceptions of authority. In that context, the Rosenbergs' refusal to submit appeared to many as early resistance to state coercion. Archival silence turned into testimonial power. The case re-entered classrooms, not as security lesson, but as moral inquiry. Internationally, revelations from decrypted communications in the 1990s, released under the Venona Project, offered partial confirmation of Soviet espionage networks within the United States. Yet the evidence remained nuanced. Julius appeared as operative, Ethel's role less certain. Historians debated whether her execution had been necessary or symbolic. The documents neither vindicated nor fully condemned. They illuminated how truth in matters of secrecy arrives fractured. The world that once demanded absolute answers learned that history delivers only approximation. By the time the Cold War ended in 1991, archives opened across continents. Scholars compared American case files with Soviet records, tracing the web of agents and couriers that had once operated in secrecy. The pattern revealed both efficiency and tragedy, systems exploiting idealism, individuals consumed by machinery of ideology. The Rosenbergs emerged as part of a vast network, shaped by belief rather than greed. Their story, viewed through the distance of decades, became less about espionage than about the fragility of moral certainty under pressure. In museums and documentaries, images of Los Alamos, Knickerbocker Village, and Sing Sing appeared in sequence, a visual equation linking science, society, and punishment. School textbooks summarized the affair in a few paragraphs, yet each new generation rediscovered the emotional gravity behind those lines. The couple who had once seemed isolated within a single courtroom now represented the intersection of secrecy, politics, and human conviction across the 20th century. Within the former laboratories of the Manhattan Project, security badges still hang beside photographs of the scientists who built the bomb. Exhibits describe breakthroughs in physics, metallurgy, and engineering. But behind glass panels, another narrative lingers: the cost of knowledge guarded too tightly. Visitors read placards about espionage and justice, standing under fluorescent light, where once equations glowed on blackboards. The air remains thick with the memory of both triumph and betrayal. Decades after the executions, the American legal system continued to grapple with the precedents set during that time. The Supreme Court cited the case in later decisions concerning the death penalty, due process, and the limits of executive clemency. Law schools used it as case study. In prosecutorial ethics, the file that had begun as an intelligence investigation became an enduring lesson on how democracies confront internal fear. The names of prosecutors, judges, and agents receded, but the moral weight of their decisions remained. By the early 21st century, declassification and renewed scholarship had stripped away some mythology. The Rosenbergs were neither innocent saints nor omniscient spies. They were human conduits, shaped by ideology and circumstance, caught in a machinery far larger than themselves. Their tragedy lay in timing. Too late for wartime unity. Too early for the skepticism that followed. In that gap, history demanded sacrifice. By the mid-1950s, the balance of fear had solidified into structure. The world that emerged from the Second World War no longer believed in permanent victory. It believed only in deterrence. In Washington, Moscow, and London, survival became arithmetic. Missile trajectories, blast radii, megatons. The Rosenbergs were gone, but the system their case had helped justify lived on in classified vaults and legislative committees. Every suspicion became policy. Every policy built another wall. The United States established new laboratories under the Atomic Energy Commission, each guarded by perimeters of fences and law. Sandia engineered detonators. Livermore designed hydrogen devices. Oak Ridge refined uranium. The scientists who once debated philosophy in desert barracks now worked inside bureaucratic mazes of forms and clearance levels. Secrecy turned from exception to routine. Even trivial memos bore the stamp of restricted data. A generation learned to speak cautiously, to publish cautiously, to think within approved boundaries. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet research cities mirrored the secrecy of their rivals. Arzamas 16 and Chelyabinsk 70 appeared on no maps, ringed by barbed wire and belief. Engineers lived in isolation, their mail censored, their successes known only to officials. The information once stolen from Los Alamos now served as foundation for innovation rather than imitation. By the decade's end, the Soviets launched an artificial satellite into orbit, proving that the same scientific discipline that had produced the bomb could also reach the heavens. Humanity entered space carrying both curiosity and dread. By the turn of the 1960s, new technologies expanded the theater of control. Computers began to catalog personnel files, automate background checks, and cross-reference political histories. Electronic memory replaced human memory, preserving suspicion with perfect recall. The ghosts of Los Alamos entered circuits and punch cards. What had begun as a secret, shared by a handful of physicists, now existed as a permanent database of trust and betrayal. The state had learned to mechanize paranoia. Meanwhile, the children of the atomic generation reached adolescence under skies filled with contrails. They learned that the world could end in minutes, yet continued to plan careers, marriages, and futures measured in decades. Cynicism and resilience coexisted. Universities taught physics as both promise and peril. Professors quoted Oppenheimer's words about destruction and responsibility, then assigned problem sets on neutron diffusion. Knowledge advanced precisely because fear forbade ignorance. The paradox defined the age, progress driven by dread. The world moved on to other crises. Vietnam, Watergate, oil embargoes. But the infrastructure of secrecy built in the early Cold War never dismantled. It adapted to new enemies and new technologies. Satellites replaced couriers. Encryption replaced code phrases. Computers replaced filing cabinets. Still, the principle remained unchanged. Information equaled power, and power required control. In that continuity lay the true legacy of atomic espionage, a civilization organized around the management of knowledge. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the cold continuum did not vanish. It diffused, nuclear arsenals remained, treaties multiplied, and intelligence agencies reinvented themselves for a world of shifting threats. The Rosenberg story re-entered public discourse, as symbol of another time, half cautionary, half romanticized. Films recreated the courtroom. Historians debated the fairness of the verdict. Activists invoked the case when warning of new persecutions. The past refused to stay archived. The continuum extended beyond nations into psychology. The age of anxiety became cultural identity. Novels filled with surveillance, films of distrust, music echoing mechanical rhythms of war machines. Children grew into adults accustomed to being observed. The state's omnipresent gaze, once a wartime necessity, evolved into accepted norm. Security replaced freedom as the measure of order. The moral arithmetic begun with the Rosenbergs, balancing safety against liberty, remained unsolved. And so the continuum endures, cold not merely in temperature, but in temperament. A steady hum of guarded knowledge beneath civilization's surface. It stretches from the fenced mesas of New Mexico to the firewalls of modern networks, from secret laboratories to encrypted clouds. The atom of fear, once split, can never be contained again. By the 2010s, digital archives replaced filing cabinets. The FBI released thousands of pages online. transforming the act of secrecy's undoing into public spectacle. Anyone with a connection could read case files once locked under steel. Researchers scrolled through declassified images of Los Alamos maps, interrogation notes, and typewritten memos, bearing the faint fingerprints of history. The democratization of access completed the circle. Secrets once stolen and punished now freely available to all. The Cold War had ended. Its paperwork had not. The ink might have dried, but the radiation of meaning continued to spread invisibly, measured not in half-lives but in memory. The world, older and no wiser, filed the records under resolved while knowing they never would be. History rarely concludes. It evolves in silence. After the declassifications, the Rosenbergs ceased to belong solely to historians. They belonged to everyone. Students writing theses, filmmakers searching for metaphors, citizens questioning power. Their names survived as a shorthand for the uneasy balance between loyalty and conscience. Every nation that had lived under the Cold War inherited their memory, whether as warning, symbol, or unresolved wound. In this way, their story extended far beyond the circumstances of their lives. In the United States, and as the 21st century deepened, their legacy remained not in ideology or verdict, but in awareness that power, left unexamined, will always find new reasons to guard itself, and conscience, left unprotected, will always pay the price. Like, share, and subscribe to stay with the mystery crime for new cases.